Cars pulled over, ma'am. License and registration, please. Those words echo through countless traffic stops across America, but on this rain-soaked evening in Cedar Grove, they marked the beginning of something extraordinary. The dashboard camera's grainy footage captured what seemed like a routine traffic stop. A black BMW sedan with slightly tinted windows, pulled over for a minor traffic violation. But what happened next would leave two veteran police officers speechless and transform an entire police department overnight. Officer Mike Sullivan had been with the Cedar Grove Police Department for 15 years. His partner, Officer James Rodriguez, was marking his 8th year on the force. It was supposed to be just another Friday night patrol, the kind they'd done hundreds of times before. The streets were slick from an early autumn drizzle, streetlights casting long reflections on the wet asphalt. They noticed the BMW roll through a stop sign at Maple and 4th. Nothing dramatic, the kind of minor infraction that usually earned a warning, or, at most, a modest ticket. Officer Sullivan flipped on the lights, and the car pulled over immediately, smooth and professional, using their turn signal and everything. So far, totally by the book. What the officers didn't know was that Sarah Mitchell had just finished a long day of meetings and paperwork in the neighboring city. After 20 years in law enforcement, rising through the ranks in Chicago and Detroit, she'd finally landed her dream job. But she hadn't officially started yet, and her new ID badge was still sitting in its envelope on the passenger seat. The tension in the air was palpable as Officer Rodriguez approached the driver's side window. Every traffic stop carries its own weight of history, its own unspoken anxieties. Sarah knew this better than most. She'd been on both sides of this equation more times than she cared to remember. "Good evening, officers." Sarah's voice was steady, confident but not confrontational. She'd already placed both hands on the steering wheel, visible and still. Old habits die hard, even when you're about to become the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the district. The beam of Officer Rodriguez's flashlight swept through the car's interior, standard procedure. In the back seat, a garment bag held her new uniform, pressed and ready for Monday morning's swearing-in ceremony. Neither officer had attended the town hall meeting where her appointment was announced. They'd been on patrol that night, too. "Ma'am, do you know why we pulled you over?" Sullivan had joined his partner, standing slightly behind him, as protocol demanded. The rain had picked up, drops catching the red and blue lights, creating a surreal atmosphere around the scene. Sarah took a slow, deliberate breath. In her 20 years of service, she'd learned that moments like these define not just careers, but communities. She could handle this a dozen different ways, but how she chose to respond would set the tone for her entire tenure as chief. The dashcam kept rolling, recording what was about to become one of the most watched traffic stop videos in recent memory. But it couldn't capture everything: the subtle shift in the officers' expressions as they realized who they were speaking to, the mix of emotions that played across their faces, the way the whole atmosphere around the car changed in an instant. What happened next would be talked about in every precinct break room, shared on social media, and eventually used in police training academies across the country. It would spark conversations about authority, identity, and the changing face of law enforcement in America. But more importantly, it would become a story about human connection, about breaking down barriers, and about the unexpected moments that can bridge even the widest divides. As Sarah reached for her credentials, she couldn't help but smile slightly. Sometimes the best lessons in leadership come when you least expect them, even on a rainy night at a routine traffic stop. The next few minutes would either create a foundation of trust and respect with her new officers, but that's where our story really begins. And to understand what happened next, we need to rewind a few months, to the day when Cedar Grove City Council made a decision that would change everything. A decision that would put Sarah Mitchell and these two officers on a collision course with destiny on this rain-soaked evening. What happened after Sarah revealed her identity? How did Officers Sullivan and Rodriguez react? And most importantly, how did this seemingly routine traffic stop transform not just 3 lives, but an entire police department? Well, that's where things get really interesting. 6 months earlier, Cedar Grove was a city at a crossroads. The retirement of Police Chief Robert Thompson, after 30 years of service, had left a void that needed filling, and the city council chambers were packed with concerned citizens. The old guard wanted someone local, someone who understood the city's traditions, but others pushed for fresh perspectives, arguing that Cedar Grove needed to evolve. Sarah Mitchell wasn't even supposed to be in the running. She'd applied on a colleague's recommendation, expecting nothing more than a polite rejection letter. Cedar Grove was smaller than the departments she worked in, but something about the community called to her. Maybe it was the way the city straddled the line between small-town values and urban progress, or perhaps it was the challenge of bridging divides that seemed to grow wider every year. The interview process was grueling. 5 rounds of questioning, background checks that went back to her high school jobs, psychological evaluations, and community panels. Sarah faced each challenge with the same quiet determination that had carried her through the police academy 20 years earlier, when female officers, especially black female officers, were even rarer than they are today. Why Cedar Grove? The question came from Councilwoman Eleanor Martinez during the final interview. The room fell silent, all eyes on Sarah. She could have given them the standard answers about career advancement or community service. Instead, she told them about David. David was her younger brother, killed during a traffic stop gone wrong when Sarah was just 19. It was that tragedy that pushed her into law enforcement, not out of vengeance, but with a deeper purpose: to change the system from within. Cedar Grove, she told them, is small enough to make real change happen, but big enough for that change to matter. The council chambers erupted in whispers. This wasn't the safe answer they expected, but it was the honest one, and it resonated with something in the community's collective conscience. 2 weeks later, Sarah Mitchell became Cedar Grove's first female police chief, and its first black chief. But accepting the job was just the beginning. The real challenge would be winning over the department's rank and file. Change never comes easy, especially in institutions built on hierarchy and tradition. Sarah knew she'd face resistance, skepticism, and maybe worse. What she didn't expect was for that crucial first test to come before she even officially started. Back in the present, as the rain drummed steadily on the BMW's roof, Officer Rodriguez was staring at Sarah's credentials with an expression that mixed disbelief, embarrassment, and something else, something that looked almost like hope. Officer Sullivan had taken a step back, his hand unconsciously adjusting his badge. The credentials told only part of the story. What they didn't show was the 20 years of hard-earned experience behind them. They didn't show the nights Sarah spent mentoring troubled teens in Chicago's South Side, or the community policing program she developed in Detroit that reduced violent crime by 30%. They didn't show the 3 commendations for bravery, or the doctoral thesis she wrote on modern policing strategies. But something else was happening in that moment, something that transcended badges and credentials. In the awkward silence that followed, broken only by the steady patter of rain and the distant wail of a siren, 3 people were sizing up not just each other, but the future of their department. Officer Rodriguez cleared his throat, clearly struggling to find the right words. His partner had shifted his weight, tension visible in his shoulders. Both men were professional enough to know this moment mattered, but human enough to feel the weight of its complexity. Sarah could have handled it various ways. She could have pulled rank immediately, could have been stern or authoritative. She could have made a joke to break the tension, or simply driven away with a warning. But she knew that whatever happened next would set the tone for her entire tenure as chief. As she opened her mouth to speak, dispatch crackled to life on the officers' radios. A domestic disturbance call, just 3 blocks away. Priority response needed. In that instant, all 3 law enforcement professionals heard the unmistakable sound of breaking glass in the background of the dispatch call. The next few seconds would prove crucial, not just for this night, but for the future of Cedar Grove's police department. How would the new chief handle this situation? How would her officers respond? And most importantly, could this awkward traffic stop transform into something more meaningful? But to understand what happened next, we need to know about another incident from Sarah's past, one that taught her the most valuable lesson of her career. A lesson about authority, trust, and the true meaning of leadership. 15 years earlier, in Chicago, Sarah Mitchell learned a lesson that would shape her entire career. She was a young sergeant then, working the midnight shift in one of the city's toughest districts. A domestic violence call came in, similar to the one now crackling over the Cedar Grove radio, and she had to make a split-second decision that would either unite her team or tear it apart. That night in Chicago, she chose to trust her officers, to work alongside them rather than just giving orders. Together, they not only resolved the situation peacefully, but formed a bond that transformed their entire precinct. Now, standing in the rain beside her BMW. Sarah saw an opportunity to apply that same lesson. "Officers," she said, her voice calm but authoritative, "I believe we all have somewhere more important to be right now." She reached into her car and pulled out her badge, not the new Cedar Grove chief's badge, but her worn detective's shield from Detroit. "How about we discuss my traffic violation after we handle this call?" Rodriguez and Sullivan exchanged quick glances. This wasn't protocol. The new chief wasn't officially on duty yet, but the urgency in the dispatcher's voice left little room for debate. Sullivan nodded first, his years of experience telling him sometimes leadership means knowing when to break from routine. "I'll follow in my vehicle," Sarah continued, already reaching for her seatbelt. "You two take point. You know the neighborhood better than I do." It was a subtle message, acknowledging their expertise while establishing her authority. The officers straightened, professional instincts kicking in. As they pulled up to the address 3 blocks away, the situation was already escalating. A second-floor window was broken, and shouting could be heard from inside. An elderly neighbor on the porch was waving them down, panic evident in her gestures. "That's the Wilson place," Rodriguez said quickly, filling in the chief. "Third domestic call this month. He's got priors, but she won't press charges." The pain in his voice revealed the frustration of a cop who'd seen this scenario too many times before. Sarah absorbed the information, her mind already racing through options. In Detroit, she developed a domestic violence intervention program that reduced repeat incidents by 40%. But right now, theory had to take a backseat to immediate action. The next few minutes would test all 3 officers. As they approached the house, Sarah noticed Sullivan instinctively taking a protective stance beside her. She'd seen it countless times before. Male officers trying to shield female colleagues, especially superior officers, from potential danger. But what happened next would challenge everyone's preconceptions. Through the broken window came the sound of a child crying. The situation had just become even more complex. Sarah's hand went to her phone, where she still had the contact information for Cedar Grove's social services coordinator, a connection she'd made during her interview process. But before she could make the call, heavy footsteps thundered down the house's front stairs. The door burst open, and James Wilson, 6'3", muscular, and clearly agitated, stood in the doorframe. His eyes darted between the officers, lingering with surprise on Sarah. The next 30 seconds would define not just this intervention, but the future working relationship between Cedar Grove's new chief and her officers. Sullivan's hand was already on his weapon. Rodriguez had taken a step forward, ready to intervene. But Sarah saw something in Wilson's eyes that reminded her of another case, another time. That's when Mrs. Wilson appeared at the top of the stairs, clutching their 5-year-old daughter. The girl's tears had stopped, replaced by a wide-eyed stare at the scene unfolding below. In that frozen moment, Sarah recognized that this wasn't just about handling a domestic dispute. It was about showing her officers a different way to approach their job. But could she defuse this situation without undermining her officers' authority? Could she demonstrate leadership while respecting their experience? And most importantly, could she protect everyone involved, the child, the mother, even James Wilson himself, while establishing the kind of department she envisioned for Cedar Grove? The answer lay in what happened next, but to understand that, we need to see how Sarah's experiences in both Chicago and Detroit had prepared her for exactly this kind of moment. A moment where authority, compassion, and justice had to work together in perfect balance. In that tense moment outside the Wilson house, time seemed to slow down. Rain continued to fall, creating a curtain of water that reflected the red and blue lights from the patrol cars. James Wilson's breathing was heavy, his fists clenched and unclenched rhythmically. Behind him, his wife and daughter remained frozen on the stairs, their faces a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Sarah took a deliberate step forward, positioning herself slightly ahead of Officers Sullivan and Rodriguez. It wasn't grandstanding. It was a calculated move she learned in Detroit during similar situations. "Mr. Wilson," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years of experience but none of the usual authoritative edge, "I'm Sarah Mitchell. This is quite a night for first impressions, isn't it?" The unexpected approach caught everyone off guard. Wilson's aggressive stance faltered slightly, confusion flickering across his face. Behind Sarah, she could sense Sullivan and Rodriguez adjusting their positions, ready to react but following her lead. I don't know who you are, Wilson growled, but the earlier rage in his voice had diminished somewhat. This is between me and my family. We don't need cops here. His eyes darted to his wife and daughter, then back to Sarah, uncertainty replacing anger. Sarah took another careful step forward, rain soaking through her civilian clothes. She could hear Rodriguez quietly radioing for backup, standard procedure in domestic situations. But she knew they might only have a few minutes to prevent this from escalating. You're right, Mr. Wilson. You don't know me, but I know something about you. Sarah kept her voice steady, remembering a similar situation in Chicago where words had proved more powerful than weapons. I know you're not just angry. You're scared. Scared of losing your family, scared of losing control, scared of what happens next. Wilson's jaw clenched, but he remained still. Behind him, Mrs. Wilson had slowly begun descending the stairs, her daughter clutched tightly to her chest. Sullivan noticed too, subtly shifting his position to maintain a clear line of sight. You don't know nothing about me, Wilson said, but his voice had lost its earlier conviction. Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between rage and reason, between pride and fear. That's when Sarah made a decision that would either establish her leadership style in Cedar Grove or destroy her credibility before she even officially started. She slowly reached up and removed her badge, holding it out where the porch light caught its surface. See this badge, Mr. Wilson? Monday morning, I become the new police chief of Cedar Grove. My first official act could be taking you to jail. But right now, I'm not here as a chief. I'm here as someone who's seen too many families torn apart, too many children traumatized, too many good people make decisions they can't take back. The tension in the air was electric. Rodriguez had inched closer, his experience telling him things could still go either way. Sullivan's hand remained near his weapon, but his eyes were fixed on Sarah, watching his new chief handle her first Cedar Grove crisis. In the distance, sirens announced the approach of backup units. They had maybe 2 minutes before the situation would be taken out of their hands. Sarah knew that whatever happened next would set the tone not just for this night, but for her entire tenure as chief. She took one more step toward Wilson, close enough now to see the tears mixing with rain on his face. Behind him, his wife had reached the bottom of the stairs, her daughter's face buried in her shoulder. The next few words would either diffuse the situation or ignite it. But before Sarah could speak, Wilson's daughter lifted her head and said something that would change everything. Her small voice cut through the rain and tension, carrying a message that would force everyone, Wilson, the officers, and even Sarah herself, to confront their own prejudices and assumptions. Those words, and what happened next, would become legendary in the Cedar Grove Police Department. But to understand their full impact, we need to recognize how this moment represented everything Sarah had been working toward throughout her career. A chance to prove that law enforcement could be both powerful and compassionate, both authoritative and understanding. Daddy, she looks like my teacher, Ms. Jackson, one who helped you find your job. The little girl's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Wilson's shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time, his eyes truly met Sarah's. Just then, another vehicle pulled up, not the expected backup patrol cars, but an unmarked sedan. Through the rain, Sarah recognized Carol Jackson stepping out, the same teacher the little girl had mentioned. She was also Cedar Grove's most respected community mediator, though Sarah had only known her from the briefing files she'd studied before taking the job. The situation had suddenly become more complex, revealing layers that went beyond a typical domestic dispute. Ms. Jackson moved forward carefully, her presence adding another dimension to the delicate balance of the moment. James, she called out softly, remember what we talked about in last week's session? Sullivan and Rodriguez exchanged glances, pieces of a bigger puzzle falling into place. This wasn't just about tonight. This was about a man struggling to change, about a family on the edge, about a community trying to help one of its own. Sarah's mind raced back to a similar case in Detroit, where community intervention had made all the difference. But before anyone could process this new development, a sharp cry came from inside the house. An older voice, filled with panic. Help, somebody. The cry changed everything. Wilson's face transformed from anguish to terror. My mother, he gasped. She was upstairs. She has heart problems. Suddenly, they weren't dealing with just a domestic dispute anymore. This was now a medical emergency, and every second counted. Sarah had to make split-second decisions that would test every aspect of her leadership. The backup sirens were still approaching, but they were running out of time. Wilson started to turn back toward the house, but Sullivan moved to block him, standard procedure in domestic situations. The tension that had just begun to dissipate threatened to explode again. Mrs. Wilson clutched her daughter tighter, tears streaming down her face. Sarah's next actions would define not just this night, but her entire approach to policing in Cedar Grove. She had 3 trained officers present: a medical emergency, a volatile domestic situation, a community mediator, and a family in crisis. The procedural handbook had no chapter for this exact scenario. Rodriguez's hand was already on his radio, calling for medical support, but the nearest ambulance was at least 10 minutes out. The backup police units were closer, but they would arrive with lights, sirens, and adrenaline pumping, potentially making the situation worse. Sarah's mind flashed back to her brother David's death, how a situation had spiraled out of control when too many factors collided at once. She couldn't let that happen here, but the rulebook was clear about letting suspects back into a house during an active domestic call. Then Ms. Jackson stepped forward, her calm voice cutting through the chaos. "Sarah," she said, revealing a connection that nobody present had known about, "there's something about the Wilson family you need to know. Something that changes everything about tonight." The rain had begun to fall harder, the red and blue lights from the patrol cars creating surreal patterns on the wet pavement. In the distance, the backup sirens grew louder. Sarah had seconds to make a decision that would either uphold traditional police protocols or forge a new path for law enforcement in Cedar Grove. But as she opened her mouth to speak, another voice joined the symphony of chaos, a voice from Sarah's own past, calling out from a newly arrived vehicle. Someone she hadn't seen in 15 years, someone who knew the whole truth about that night in Chicago that had shaped her career. The next few moments would test everything Sarah believed about law enforcement, about community, about trust. And the choice she was about to make would either heal multiple wounds at once or tear Cedar Grove's fragile social fabric apart. The figure emerging from the newly arrived vehicle was Dr. Michael Chen, Sarah's old partner from Chicago. The same Dr. Chen who now ran Cedar Grove's community health program, a detail Sarah hadn't known until this moment. As he hurried through the rain, his medical bag in hand, pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. "Sarah," he called out, moving quickly toward the house. "James Wilson is part of our pilot program, the one we designed in Chicago, the one that integrated medical care with domestic intervention." Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. This wasn't just coincidence. This was the program she'd helped create finding its way to Cedar Grove before she did. In that moment, Sarah made her decision. "Officer Sullivan, escort Mr. Wilson and Dr. Chen upstairs. Officer Rodriguez, stay with Mrs. Wilson and their daughter." She turned to Ms. Jackson. "Carol, I think we need your help too." The seasoned teacher nodded, already moving to comfort the family. As they entered the house, Wilson's mother could be heard breathing heavily upstairs. Dr. Chen took the lead, his presence transforming the atmosphere from confrontational to cooperative. Wilson, now focused solely on his mother's well-being, followed the doctor's instructions without hesitation. What happened next would become a textbook example of community policing. While Dr. Chen treated Mrs. Wilson's anxiety attack, triggered by the argument she'd overheard, Miss Jackson sat with the family in the living room. The story emerged gradually. James Wilson wasn't just another angry man. He was someone actively seeking help, enrolled in anger management classes, working with a counselor. Tonight's incident had been triggered by a setback at his new job, the one Ms. Jackson had helped him find. Sarah watched as Officer Sullivan's defensive posture gradually relaxed, as Officer Rodriguez engaged in gentle conversation with Mrs. Wilson. This wasn't just about preventing a crisis. It was about understanding one family's struggle to heal itself. But the real revelation came when Dr. Chen emerged from upstairs. "Sarah," he said quietly, "remember that program you designed in Chicago? The one that never got funded?" She nodded, remembering the disappointment. "Well, Cedar Grove implemented it 6 months ago. That's why I'm here. That's why the council chose you as chief. They wanted someone who understood that law enforcement is about more than just enforcing laws." The backup units had arrived outside, but Sarah gestured for them to stand down. Through the window, She could see the red and blue lights reflecting off the wet streets, a reminder of how differently this night could have ended. Then came the twist that no one expected. Mrs. Wilson, still holding her daughter, stood up and pulled a folded paper from her pocket. "I was going to bring this to the station tomorrow," she said, her voice steady. "I've been selected to lead the Community Oversight Committee for the police department. The same committee that recommended you for chief, Sarah." She smiled sadly. "Tonight was supposed to be our celebration dinner." The irony hung in the air for a moment before James Wilson spoke up, his voice rough with emotion. "I messed up tonight, but not like before. This time I called for help myself, called Ms. Jackson before things got bad. That's what they taught us in the program. That's what I'm learning to do." As the night wound down, Sarah found herself back outside with Officers Sullivan and Rodriguez. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and cool. "Chief," Sullivan said, breaking the silence, "about that traffic stop earlier." But Sarah held up her hand. "I did roll through that stop sign," she said with a small smile, "and I expect my officers to enforce the law equally and fairly. How about we start fresh Monday morning? Maybe over coffee, before my swearing-in?" As they headed back to their patrol car, Rodriguez turned back. "Chief Mitchell? That thing you did tonight. Handling the situation, bringing everyone together, making it about help instead of punishment, is that how it's going to be from now on?" Sarah looked at her new officers, then at the Wilson house where a family was beginning to heal, and finally at the badge in her hand. "No," she said thoughtfully. "It's going to be better. Because now we're going to do it together." But even as the night ended on this note of hope, another challenge was already emerging, one that would test this new approach to its limits. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't making change happen, it's making it last. Monday morning arrived with the kind of golden sunrise that makes everything feel possible. The Cedar Grove Police Department's main conference room was packed, not just with officers and city officials, but with community members. The Wilsons sat in the front row, James in a crisp suit, his daughter proudly wearing her future police chief badge that Officer Rodriguez had given her. Before the formal swearing-in ceremony, Sarah had kept her promise. She sat with Officers Sullivan and Rodriguez in the local diner, drinking coffee and talking about their vision for the department. She'd written them each a citation for their handling of Friday night's situation, not a reprimand, but a commendation for showing the kind of judgment and compassion she wanted to become standard practice. "You know," Sullivan said, stirring his coffee, "when we pulled you over Friday night, I thought it was just going to be another traffic stop story for the break room." He shook his head, smiling. "Instead, it's becoming the foundation of our new training program." Sarah looked around the diner, at the morning regulars, the waitress who knew everyone's orders by heart, the community she was now responsible for protecting. "That's exactly what Cedar Grove needed," she said. "Not just a story, but a reminder that every interaction is an opportunity to make a difference." The swearing-in ceremony itself was brief, but what followed set the tone for everything to come. Instead of a traditional speech, Sarah invited James Wilson to share his story. He stood at the podium, nervous but determined, and talked about how a community's willingness to help rather than judge had changed his life. "6 months ago, I was the guy everyone crossed the street to avoid," he said, his voice steady. "Today, I'm speaking at our new police chief's swearing-in. That's not just change, that's transformation." His words resonated through the room, touching officers and civilians alike. Dr. Chen presented the preliminary results of their community intervention program. Domestic incident rates down 40%, repeat calls reduced by 60%. But it was Ms. Jackson who put it into perspective. "We're not just reducing crime statistics," she said. "We're helping families stay together, helping people find better ways to handle their struggles." After the ceremony, Sarah found herself back in her new office, looking at the photographs being hung on the wall. There was one of her brother David, whose tragic death had inspired her career. Next to it, a picture from her graduation from the police academy. And now, a new photo would join them, one taken just that morning, showing her with Sullivan and Rodriguez at the diner, all three laughing over coffee. A knock on the door revealed Mrs. Wilson, still in her role as Community Oversight Committee head. "Chief Mitchell," she said, "I have our first official recommendation." She handed over a proposal for expanding the intervention program to neighboring districts. "We think what happened Friday night shouldn't be the exception. It should be the model." Sarah looked at the proposal, then at her calendar. Her first official meeting was scheduled for that afternoon, a department-wide briefing on new protocols and expectations. But she already knew her message would go beyond procedures and policies. It would be about transformation, about seeing every challenge as an opportunity for positive change. As she prepared for the meeting, Sarah thought about that traffic stop, how a simple roll through a stop sign had set in motion a chain of events that revealed the true character of her new department and community. Sometimes she realized leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to learn them together. The story of Cedar Grove's new police chief quickly spread beyond the city limits. Other departments began requesting information about their intervention program. News outlets picked up the story of the traffic stop that changed everything. But within Cedar Grove itself, the real change was happening quietly, one interaction at a time. Officer Rodriguez started a youth mentoring program. Sullivan began teaching community engagement at the police academy. And every Friday night, without fail, Sarah joined her officers for coffee at the local diner, not as their chief, but as their partner in building a better community. As for the Wilsons, they became living proof that change is possible when a community comes together. James found strength in helping others, sharing his story with families struggling with similar challenges. His daughter's future police chief badge became a treasured possession, a symbol of how far they'd come and how far they could still go. And that stop sign at Maple and 4th, it became an unofficial landmark in Cedar Grove, known as Chief's Corner. Not because someone rolled through it, but because it marked the spot where a new chapter in community policing began. A chapter that proved sometimes the most powerful law enforcement tool isn't authority or force, but understanding and compassion. As Sarah Mitchell completed her first month as chief, she added one final photo to her office wall, a shot of that stop sign at dawn, the rising sun creating a golden glow around its edges. Under it, she placed a simple caption, "Every ending is just another beginning." Because in Cedar Grove, they learned that true justice isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about building bridges, one traffic stop at a time.